Mm.
Oh, Michael, I remembered something I wanted to say. If there's a new person, leave just a minute at the end for me to say something about Donna, if
Will
you remember.
do. Well, I
Thank
will. Yeah.
you. For the old folks, they have heard it.
Yes,
They don't
they
need,
know.
they know.
Two. Mm. Mhm. Oh, cool. Yeah. Mhm. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Um, Happy New Year. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. MC Owens as usual. San Francisco Dharma Collective as usual. Happy to be back after a couple of weeks away. Lovely to see you all. Um, Tonight, it's Sutra Study. So we're diving back in to the good old middle-length discourses. We're moving right along to the next sutta or the next sutra. This is going to be sutra number 74. I want to remind you that this collection has about 150 sutras, and they're divided into the first 50, the middle 50, and you guessed it, the last 50. And we're right in the middle. We're again, Sutra number 74. And this is a little group of 10 sutras that are all teachings that the Buddha gave to wanderers. We finished right before the Christmas break. We did Sutta number 71, 72, and 73. And they were three sutras, but they were all teachings given to this one guy, Vacchagotta. And what we saw was that the Buddha slowly kind of brought Vacchagotta over to the Dharma. Like that was a kind of a conversion story. Well, the same thing's going to happen tonight, but tonight the Buddha is going to be talking to Dīghanakha. So Dīghanakha is our wanderer. So he's another one of these Paribbājakas, these wanderers. I want to remind you that, the idea here is that at the time of the Buddha, there were a lot of different, um, call them religions, but that might not be the right word exactly. You could call them philosophies, also maybe a little too modern of an idea. But my point is that the Buddha, with his little group, they were one among many of these different groups. They were doing yoga, or what we would today call yoga. They were doing meditation. But as we're going to see tonight, they were all also interested in, I guess, what we would call metaphysics. Again, philosophy or whatever, but it's about ideas. You could say it's about the mind in that way. And of course, as I know that you already know, in India, kind of like religion and philosophy, always the same thing. Like the idea of yoga, a physical practice, and a kind of metaphysical practice, those go hand in hand. So this will be another kind of dive into, well, again, I don't know quite what word to use, metaphysics or philosophy, but it's a very philosophical text tonight. Um, yeah, I think we can actually just dive right in because the main themes, the main ideas, they are stated right away. So allow me to read just the little beginning of this, and then we're going to kind of dissect it in classic Dharma Doors fashion. So again, this is little number Sutta 74 to the wanderer Dīghanakha. And the beginning goes something like this. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Buddha, the Blessed One, was living at Rajgriha, the capital city, in the boar's cave on Mount Gridrakutta, or the Vulture's Peak. Then, at that time, the wanderer Dīghanakha went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. And then when this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he stood to one side and he said to the Blessed One, Master Gautama, my doctrine, my view is this. Nothing is acceptable to me. Now, the Buddha is going to have something to say about that, but I want you to kind of really fully understand what's being spoken about here before we even get into the exchange. So this whole sutra tonight is about views, or what is being called a view. Or I should say it's about doctrines and views, right? Belief structures and views, right? So the Buddha is going to have a lot to say about this idea of it's called a dittihi, or in Sanskrit, a drishtihi. And it's this idea of having a worldview. And here's the thing, and I always like to remind everybody kind of has a worldview because it's what you think is going on here. So allow me quickly to remind you, when we're talking about a view here, there's a number of different ideas that are involved in a view. One idea or one aspect of having a worldview, we might call it the cosmology. And so the idea is that there are different ideas about where the world comes from. There's different ideas about what upholds or supports the world. You might be thinking of like physical laws of gravity and electromagnetic attraction or something, but that's sort of an idea, one idea of what upholds the world. And another part of a cosmological view is the destruction or the end of the world. So a cosmology is part of a worldview or part of a drishti or part of a dittihi. There is also, you might call it like a personal cosmology. And that is the idea of like, well, but where did I come from? Like, meaning like, where did I come from before? What is sustaining or upholding or supporting my existence now? And that age-old question, what happens after we die? That is also a deep part of having a view. And of course, there are many different views about where life comes from, what supports life, and what happens to life after it expires. Again, I want to make it really clear, a view could be anything. Maybe you think after death, you just get recycled in some sort of like reincarnation situation. That's a view. But you might also be a scientific materialist, and you think that this is just a very complicated bioelectrical chemical dance. And when the dance is over, there's just no more existence. That's another idea. And then there's the good old theology of heaven and hell. And that's the idea that after this is over, you're going to either go up to heaven with God or down to hell to suffer. And then we might throw in a little limbo idea, purgatory idea, in case that, neither of those examples work for you. But my point is, tonight we're talking about views, all of them. So I quickly walked us through the cosmology in terms of where the world comes from and where it's going, the personal cosmology in terms of where our life comes from and where it's going. And there's another very important, for tonight especially, it's another very important aspect of having a view. It's the idea of what should be done. Should anything be done? Are there things I shouldn't do? What I'm talking about, of course, is like morality and ethics. That's part of a view. And I want you to notice that there's a lot of different opinions or a lot of different views, which is to say, some people think, do whatever you want. The only thing you have to fear is the law, like man-made law, but do whatever you want. Or you have very strict ideas of morality, a kind of God said, thou shalt not do X, Y, and Z. And so your worldview is based upon that morality. And then there's all kinds of other moralities or not. Because I want to remind you that, like, not having a moral code, that's a view too. So I wanted to spend this time in the beginning to remind us that these are all the aspects of views, and I've left a lot out, but the idea of a cosmology, questions of life and death, and questions of morality. Those are three big areas in the Venn diagram of world of views, and they're all going to be relevant tonight. So now I can kind of unpack for you this guy, Dīghanakha. So Dīghanakha says, hey, Buddha, blessed one, hey, world honored one. My belief, my doctrine, my view is that nothing is acceptable. In other words, he's saying, my view is that there is nothing that is true. There's nothing to hold on to. In the Western philosophical tradition, you might call this guy Dīghanakha, you might call him a skeptic, an extreme skeptic in that way. But really quickly, even before we get to the Buddha's very interesting retort, I really want us to understand like what it is that Dīghanakha, like what is he espousing? And if you think about it, it's like he's saying, like, so, in other words, if somebody came up to Dīghanakha and said, did God create the world? Dīghanakha is going to say, nope, that position is not acceptable to me. Oh, so it's a big chaos, a big chaotic accident? No, that position is not acceptable to me. Oh, it is this? No. How about this? So Dīghanakha is saying there is no view or doctrine that he accepts. All right, everybody kind of understand I mean, this is a big statement. But now this is where Buddhism is so impressive. Remember, this text is very old. But the Buddha says, in response to that, he says, this view of yours, agisana or agivesana, and agivesana is like another way of saying a Brahmin. It's like an Agni, a fire worshiper title. So he just refers to him as like a Brahmin. So he says, this view of yours, Agnivasana, this view that nothing is acceptable to me, is not at least that view acceptable to you? And then Dīghanakha says, if this view of mine were acceptable to me, Master Gotama, it too would be the same. It too would be the same. So he's saying, well, yeah, if I held that view, I would not hold that view. Right? So he's saying, no, I don't accept anything. But does that work? Does that logic really work? I'm going to share something with you in a moment, but let's kind of get to this little next part. The Buddha says in response to that, so he says, yeah, like if that were my view, then I would have to not accept that view. And the Buddha says, well, Agnivasana, there are plenty of people in the world who say it too would be the same, that it too would be the same, yet they do not actually abandon that view, and they take up still some other view. They are few in the world who say it too would be the same. It too would be the same. And then who go on to abandon that view and they don't take up another view. All right. So the Buddha basically calls Dīghanakha out on that whole form of logic. And I want to share another version of this. This is a version that you might have heard from me before. It's a version you might have heard from other Dharma teachers, because Dharma teachers often use this example. And what it is it's the phrasing of it. So this is just another way of saying the same thing. But it's the idea that it's the statement, there are no absolute truths. But that sounds like an absolute statement. So that sounds like it's an absolute truth that there are no absolute truths. So what I want you to notice in that little logical fallacy there, if there are no absolute final truths, then that cannot be finally true. And therefore, it negates itself. But if you say there's no absolute truths and that's absolutely true, you negate yourself. Notice that you can't say that there's no absolute truths. You could think that, meaning like you could say that, but if you look more carefully, you'll realize you can't really logically hold that position. The same thing's going on here with Dīghanakha, where he's saying, yeah, I don't hold any position. And the Buddha's saying, don't you hold that position, that you don't hold any position? And it's the same logical fallacy. where he's either going to negate himself by holding that view, or he's going to negate his view by not holding that view. Everybody kind of get the little, by the way, this is very sophisticated logic and philosophy for a 2,500-year-old text. That little retort of the Buddha's is like very profound. Everybody okay with that? That's actually the hardest part of the sutra, is that little like, whoa, wait, what happened? Okay. Now we're going to move to kind of part two of the sutra, where the Buddha is going to get more into like his kind of position. And what we want to be really paying attention to tonight, what's the Buddhist view? That's what we want to be like looking for. All right. So after the Buddha says, yeah, there's a lot of people who say that they'll abandon their view, but then all they do is either pick up a new view or they don't actually abandon their view. So that's paragraph 3. And then the Buddha sort of digresses and he says, Agivasana. There are some recluses and Brahmins whose doctrine and view is this: everything is acceptable to me. It's all good. There are some recluses and Brahmins whose doctrine and view is this: nothing is acceptable to me. That's Dīghanakha's view. And he says, there are some recluses and Brahmins whose doctrine and view is this: some things are acceptable to me, and some things are not acceptable to me. Among these, so among those 3 options, he says, among these, the view of those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that everything is acceptable to me, among these, among these, the view of those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that everything is acceptable to me, the Buddha says that's really close to lust. It is close to bondage. It's close to delighting. It's close to holding. It's close to clinging. The view, he says, of those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that nothing is acceptable to me, that is actually very close to not having lust. It's very close to non-bondage. It's very close to non-delighting. It's very close to non-holding, and it's very close to non-clinging. And when this was said, the wanderer Dīghanakha remarked, Master Gautama commends my point of view. Master Gautama recommends my point of view. Now, because of where this is going, let me clarify the idea of being close to lust, clinging, and all of that, right? So we want to kind of remember, kind of in the background, all of our other Dharma lessons, that Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha in that way, they're very, very concerned about unchecked desire, right? That idea of like being overly desirous for things to the point, and this is sort of my language, but to the point where you need these things, basically like you're addicted to them in that way. And that type of addiction to sensory stimuli, it's problematic. And ultimately, it's a source of suffering to be dependent. We want to be independent. We want to be sovereign. So the Buddha or Buddhism, it's very like concerned about desire that then can turn into wanting, that can turn into craving, that can turn into holding, that can turn into clinging. And the idea here is that if you're clinging, you're like clinging to an object, that it's like, this is my source of happiness. What the Buddha recognized is that's a recipe for disaster because this is impermanent. This is going to go away. And so if you're dependent or if your happiness is dependent on this, you have set yourself up for disaster. So the Buddha or Buddhism is interested in us not needing things in that way. And so what he says is this view that it's all good. It's all good. Like do whatever you want to do. Right? If you want to do this, do that. You want to drink this, drink that. You want to take this, take that. Like it's all good. Everything's acceptable. The Buddha says that's a little too close to the craving, the wanting, the lust, because it's just like, it's basically saying like, yeah, dive in. So the Buddha's saying that view, the view that anything goes, that is too close to the things that I'm warning you against. Then he turns to what is basically Dīghanakha's view, this view that nothing is acceptable to me. And the Buddha says, yeah, that view, that's close to non-desire or non-lust, to use the language of this translation. That's close to not desiring. Yeah, because you don't accept anything. So yeah, you're not going to cling to a view. You're not going to cling to an ideology. You're not going to cling to a substance. You're saying it's nothing is acceptable to me. And the Buddha says that is really close to what I'm talking about. It's close to non-desire. It's close to non-clinging. Now, Dīghanakha hears that, and again, he's like, the Buddha says that my view is the view. He recommends my view. He did not recommend that view. He just said it's closer to what I'm talking about than that other view. But let's remember, there was a third option. It was the option of, no, I reject some things and I accept other things. Agivasana. As to those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that some things are acceptable to me and some things are not acceptable to me, the view of theirs as to what is acceptable, that part of it, like what they accept, that's close to lust or desire. That's close to bondage. That's very close to delighting, close to holding, close to clinging. While the view, same people, but while the view of theirs as to what is not acceptable, that too is very close to non-lust, close to non-bondage, close to non-delighting, close to non-holding, close to non-clinging. So basically, it's a little bit of both, right? Now, Agivasana, a wise person among those recluses and Brahmins, among those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that everything is acceptable to me, yeah, that person who accepts everything, they consider this way. If I obstinately adhere to my view that everything is acceptable, and I declare that only this is true, everything else is wrong, then I might clash with the other two groups of recluses and Brahmins. With the recluse or Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that nothing is acceptable to me, and I might conflict with the recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that something is acceptable and some things are not acceptable to me. I might clash with these two groups of people. And when there's a clash, there are disputes. When there are disputes, there's quarrels. And when there's quarreling, there's vexation. Thus, foreseeing for themselves clashes, disputes, quarrels, and vexation, that person abandons that view and does not take up another view. This is how there comes to be the abandonment of these views. This is how there comes to be the relinquishment of these views. All right, so now we've gotten to like the meat of it. The Buddha is most concerned with quarreling, fighting, and in particular, the stress, anxiety, and vexation that comes from interpersonal conflict. Buddhism and the Buddha is very concerned and interested in avoiding conflict. So what the Buddha says is, the problem with holding the view that everything is all good, everything is true, the problem with holding that view is that you might come up against those people that think nothing is true, or those people that think some things are true and some things are not true. And because you're holding on to that view that nothing is true, that could lead to quarrels and conflict. That's what the Buddha wants us to avoid. And so he says, anybody who's wise can foresee the conflict that they would have with those other groups of people, and thus foreseeing for themselves the quarrels and the vexation to come, that person abandons the view that everything is true, and they don't take up another view. That's how there comes to be the abandonment of views. All right, question about the way that logic is working. Any thoughts or ideas about that? Feeling okay about the logic? Yeah, makes sense, right? Let's do it again then. Now, a wise person among those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that nothing is acceptable to me, nothing is true, they consider this way. You know, if I obstinately adhere to my view that nothing is acceptable, that nothing is true, and I declare that only that is true and everything else is wrong, then I might clash with the other two. With the recluse and Brahmin who holds the doctrine and view that everything is acceptable, and with the recluses and Brahmin who holds the doctrine and view that some things are acceptable and some things are not acceptable. I might clash with these two. And when there's a clash, there are disputes. And when there's disputes, there's quarreling. And where there are quarrels, there's vexation. Thus, foreseeing for themselves clashes and disputes and quarrels and vexation, they abandon the view that nothing is acceptable, and they do not take up another view. This is how there comes to be the abandoning of these views. This is how there comes to be the relinquishing of these views. And now, one more time, a wise person among those recluses and Brahmins who hold the doctrine and view that some things are acceptable and some things are not acceptable, This third category of person, they think, you know, if I obstinately adhere to my view that something is acceptable and some things are not acceptable, and I declare that only that is true and everything else is wrong, then I might clash with those two others, with a recluse or a Brahmin who holds the doctrine and view that everything is acceptable, and with a recluse and Brahmin who holds the doctrine and view that nothing is acceptable. I might clash with these two. And when there's a clash, there's disputes. And when there's disputes, there's quarreling. And where there's quarrels, there's vexation. Thus, foreseeing for himself or for themselves clashes and disputes and quarrels and vexation, they abandon the view and they don't take up another view. This is how there comes to be the abandoning of these views. This is how there comes to be the relinquishing of these views. All right. Now, if you read Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, if you read their footnote, the commentary tradition, so, there's a whole like commentarial tradition on the sutras. And so in the commentarial tradition, it's actually at this point that Dīghanakha, or, Agivasana as he's called in that way, he has now seen the light. So according to the commentarial tradition, that discourse by the Buddha on avoiding quarrels apparently showed Dīghanakha the error of holding the view that nothing is true or that nothing is acceptable. And everybody kind of get what's going on there? Now, we can save it for a little later, but I do want us to be thinking about, I think it's actually really important that we be thinking about what would that mean to not take up another view? Like what would that actually mean? And what I really want us to think about, like, because I want to keep with the message of the sutra, what I really want you to think about is this. Take, take any topic. And by that, I mean, like, you could take the world of politics, left-leaning, right-leaning, or whatever. You could take the world of religion, Catholics, Muslims, like all these different people, right? What I want you to be thinking about is, or I actually, even more than thinking, I actually really want you to like feel this. And what I want you to feel is, if you were not obstinately holding on to any view, like, it's like, does God exist? And it's like, I'm not going to like hold on too tight to the view that God exists, but I'm also not going to hold too tight to the view that he doesn't exist. So I'm not going to hold too tight to that idea. I'm not going to hold too tight to the idea that being religious is right or being religious is wrong. I'm not going to hold to that view. I want you to kind of feel how, if you're not holding on to one of those views like that, I want you to feel how you would have no reason to argue with anybody. And actually, you could flip it and notice how all of your arguments are actually because you are steeped in something and holding on to it very tightly. Either the idea that I'm right and you're wrong, it was my turn, not your turn, whatever the argument might be, if you look very carefully, the quarreling, the dispute, the vexation is coming from you holding on to a view. And now I want to kind of really challenge you tonight, like philosophically challenge you tonight. What I want you to think about, and I'm not saying anything, I'm not going to give you any answers to this, but I do want you to think about, what do we feel or what do we think is at stake if we don't cling to a view? Do we feel there is anything at stake? Again, I don't have any answers or really even commentary at this point, but I just want you to kind of really think about those ideas. Um, Two ideas in particular. The quarreling and vexation that only could arise from clinging to an opinion or a view. So I want us to think about that. And I want us to really think about like what reservations do I have in terms of just not clinging to any view in that way. Again, these are very rhetorical questions in that sense, just to think about. Any questions or inspirations? Yeah, no.
Um, this is such a great topic, and it's remind me of some things that came up for me recently where I felt that I was being kind of strident. And, you know, I think for me, I'm gonna sort of answer your question. I know it was rhetorical, but I think it's for me, it is related to my selfing, like having a me who is principled or right, and which doesn't mean I might never express an opinion or have a perspective on something, and even well, I won't go there. I mean, I think there's a place for a kind of argument that is not um, that doesn't have the vexation, that doesn't have the clinging to the self, that doesn't have the edge that leads to the kind of disharmony that the Buddha's arguing against, that's related to all this. That's,
Yep.
thank you.
And at that point, right, language, it's like it's like, oh, maybe then we're talking about discourse. Discourse is not conflictive, it's not argument, it's not vexation. Maybe could become, but so yeah, that's a kind of an interesting language question there too, in terms of, and remembering that we have these other words, you know, like discernment versus judgment. You can separate two things without judging them as better or worse, but there can still be discernment. You can have discourse, but not necessarily with views and the vexation. So excellent. Yeah. Maria.
Just a quick comment. I too think this is a great topic, and especially in the context of the world that we live in. I think there's so much pressure on us, at least, especially in this society, to take sides, in spite of the fact that it probably lies at the root of most of the world's problems, at least the ones that revolve around conflict. So so much wisdom here, and applicable to our lives.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, if there's any, like serious philosophers out there, and your what's called the Kantian maxim. So Immanuel Kant, Western German philosopher, he's very famous for coming up with what is called this ethical or moral maxim. And what it is whatever you want to do or whatever you want to think, apply it to everybody. Make it a universal maxim, a universal standard that everybody gets to do that. Does your ethic still work? Is it still ethical if everybody gets to do it? So Kant created what he called this moral maxim, which says it's ethical if it's universally applicable. I'm grossly paraphrasing all of Kantian philosophy. But if you're familiar with that idea, what I want you to notice, this Buddhist idea fits. If nobody was obstinately clinging to a view, it might very well be a utopia. From a Buddhist point of view, that is the root of all the world's conflicts. And it's not about having opinions in that way or having ideas. It's about thinking you're right and you are in truth. That I'm sitting in the truth with my opinion or my worldview. That's where all the conflict in the world comes from, is people thinking they're sitting in the truth. And so this whole thing is about the Buddha being like, yo, be careful with clinging to this idea of I'm right. So, ready to move on to the next part? Cool. So again, there was sort of like the first part where Dīghanakha's like, I don't accept anything. And the Buddha sort of does an interesting logical retort to that. Then there's the description of the different kinds of holding of views and why they lead to vexation. And then the Buddha says, and I'm in section or paragraph 9, the Buddha says, now, agivasana, this body made of material form, made of rupa, consisting of the 4 great elements, procreated by a mother and a father, and built up out of boiled rice and porridge. This body, made of form, is subject to impermanence, to being worn and rubbed away, to dissolution and disintegration. This body, made of form, it should be regarded as impermanent, as suffering, as like a disease, like a tumor. It should be seen as a dart, as a calamity, as an affliction, as alien. Interesting. As it should be seen as disintegrating. It should be seen as empty or void. It should be seen as not the self. When one regards this body thus, one abandons desire for the body. One abandons afflictions of the body. And number 3, one abandons subservience to the body. So let's deal with that. The Buddha is going to go much further than that, but that's a really important one, of course. This should not be news, right? This statement should not be new to us, but I do want to walk us through it. This, of course, is like the fundamental teaching of Buddhism. And one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism is that what we consider to be our body is not the self. It happens that mind goes, hey, this is me, and clings to the body of form as the self, as me in that way. But the Buddha is here to tell Dīghanakha, remember, this body, it's impermanent. It's disintegrating. In fact, I want to kind of mention something. I want to remind you about something that we talk about a lot in Dharma Doors. And it's about, like, I often use like my fingernails as examples. And, I don't know how often you cut your fingernails in that way, But you could really quickly realize that these fingernails are not the same fingernails I had a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, certainly not as a baby. So these fingernails keep growing. I keep cutting them, they keep growing, and they're not the same fingernails. But here I am. And by me, I mean the mind that is thinking about this. And the mind has been watching these impermanent fingernails grow, cut, disintegrate, fall apart. In other words, when I'm cutting my fingernails, I'm not like, ah, I'm being destroyed. Even though as a child, I did run away from my parents when they wanted to cut my fingernails because I did think they were going to come destroy me. But of course, I outgrew such silly notions. And my point is, I don't identify as these fingernails. I don't think these fingernails are me. And therefore, when they go flushing down the toilet or go wherever they go, I'm still here in that way. So if you're like me, you don't identify as your fingernails. By extrapolation, of course, this goes for your hands, all the cells of your hands that have also died and been replaced by new cells over your life. In fact, it goes for the entire impermanent body of form made up of the four great elements. But this is the trick, though. Mind forgets everything I just told you and does identify with the physical body of form as self. It does it all the time. It's what the Buddha calls the five aggregates subject to clinging. It's like what they're in the business of doing is clinging. And so what the Buddha's talking about is you're identifying with the impermanent. You're identifying with what you already know is not you. But insofar as you are identifying with it, you're suffering. You're fearful of losing it. You're fearful of all of these things. I'm fearful of all of these things related to the physical body. And what I want you to notice tonight as like good Dharma students, I want you to notice how identifying with the body of form is a straight line to suffering. And I want you to notice how not doing that could possibly alleviate suffering. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, it can go all the way to zero, no suffering. But I know that that might be a leap of faith for some. But so we don't need to go all the way. We don't need to talk about arahatship, zero suffering. We can just talk about increasing suffering or decreasing suffering. Let's just keep it real simple in that way. And Buddhism, of course, is always interested in decreasing suffering, decreasing vexation, decreasing anxiety, all of that. And so the Buddha is telling Dīghanakha here, it is this view, and even though the Buddha hasn't said it, he's implying that there's this view that this is me. And the Buddha's saying, guess what, Dīghanakha? This body of form, it's impermanent, it's being worn out, it's being rubbed away, it's subject to dissolution and disintegration. And a good way to look at it is as a disease, as a dart, as affliction, as suffering, as void, as not self. That's how it should be viewed. That's the teaching. Certainly it's the teaching of early Buddhism represented by this text. The major one that I want to emphasize, because it's sort of like, I think it's sort of the kind of, it's underneath this Dharma talk tonight, I really want to focus on that last one. When one regards the body this way, one abandons desire for the body, one abandons affection for the body, and number three, they abandon subservience to the body. I've already mentioned it a few times tonight. I've mentioned this idea of being free, being liberated, unbound. And what I talked about was noticing that if your pleasure in this life is dependent upon things, then you are a slave to those things in that way. You're subservient to those things because you need them. Who's in charge if you need them? They're in charge if you need them. But notice, I'm no longer talking about attachment and clinging to stuff or objects. At this point, we're talking about dependence on the body. And the very last of these, that if you see the body this way, as it really is, which is ever-changing, constantly in flux, totally impermanent, if you see it that way, you could abandon subservience to the body. So what I'm getting at is that even if you were to kind of relinquish all of your attachment to stuff, that would be a great freedom. By the way, for anybody out there that maybe didn't hear me right, I didn't say give away all your stuff. I did not say become homeless. I did not say become impoverished. What I said was not being attached to your stuff. Some traditions would encourage you to actually give it away. I'm just here to encourage you not to need it in that way. So that's that line, that's that part. Now, the Buddha here in this section 9, he was talking about this physical body made of the 4 elements. And this, by the way, again, is the first aggregate or the first skandha, the body of form. I mentioned the 5 aggregates. Well, this is the first one. Any questions about this body made of rice and porridge? Everybody? Of course. Oatmeal, steel cut, whatever you're into. But the idea is the body that requires that type of maintenance. All right, let's move on to the next section. Now we move on to Vedana, otherwise known as sensations or feelings. So this is the second aggregate. By the way, it's also the second foundation of mindfulness. The body of form is the first foundation of mindfulness. So there's a lot of overlap in the teachings here. But now we are not talking about the physical body. When we're talking in Buddhism, when we're talking about Vedana or sensations, we are now in the realm of the mind, of the mental. Indeed, it is the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body that are the physical sensory organs. But when the Buddha is talking about sensations, it's in the realm of the mind, not the physical realm of the sense organs themselves. And what the Buddha says regarding sensations is he says there are agivasana, 3 kinds of vedana, 3 kinds of feeling or sensations. There's pleasant sensations, sukha vedana. There are painful sensations, dukkha vedana. And there are neither pleasant nor painful sensations or feelings. The Buddha says, on the occasion when one feels a pleasant feeling, one does not feel painful feelings. Excuse me. So when one is feeling a pleasant feeling, one does not feel painful feelings or neither painful nor pleasant feelings. On the occasion when one feels only on the occasion when one only feels pleasant feelings, they're not feeling those other kinds of feelings. On the occasion when one is feeling painful sensations, one does not feel pleasant sensations or neither painful nor pleasant sensations. And on that occasion, when one feels neither painful nor pleasant feelings, one does not feel totally pleasant feelings or totally painful feelings. On that occasion, one feels only neither painful nor pleasant sensations. Really quickly, just to make everything super clear, the Buddha here is talking about a delightful sensation, a pleasant sensation. And the idea of a pleasant sensation is you would like it to keep going. Then there's painful sensations. And the thing about painful sensations is we want them to stop as soon as possible. But what about, really quickly, this neither painful nor pleasant sensation? I want to really quickly mention, I used it, yeah, we have plenty of time. Yeah, really, really quickly, allow me to give you my example of a neither painful nor pleasant sensation so that we can kind of understand all three of these. An example I used to use a lot is, I used to use this example that imagine that you're going to go to a cafe because you have some work to do. Like you want to sit down and get some work done. All right. And you go to this cafe and you're sitting there trying to do your work, but they're playing this really annoying music. It's like 8 in the morning and they're playing techno and it's like, so you're having a negative, painful, I know that that might be a bit extreme, but a negative, painful sensation to the music. I'm trying to work. I want that music to stop. That's one example, and that's an example of a unpleasant or painful sensation. Notice how it's disrupting your work. Now, same scenario, you go to the cafe to get work done, and they're playing your favorite song. And it's a song that like takes you back to like your youth. And so you're having this very pleasant experience with this song. You definitely, you turn it up. I want to hear the song. But notice you're not doing your work. Notice that you're distracted by the pleasant sensation of the music in that way. So that's my example of a kind of painful reaction to a sensation, or a sensation reacted to that is pleasant and painful. The third option, though, neither pleasant nor painful, that is when the person next to you says, "Don't they play the best music here?" And you go, "Oh, yeah, there's music playing." Meaning, you didn't have a negative reaction to it. You didn't have a positive reaction to it. It was just ambient in the room in that way. So that's kind of this kind of example of a neither painful nor pleasant, neutral reaction to things in that way. So those are the three kinds of sensation, three kinds of feelings in that way. Now let's hear the Buddha's sort of advice about these things. He says, pleasant sensations or pleasant feelings Agivasana, they're impermanent. They're conditioned. They're dependently arisen. They're subject to destruction. They are vanishing. They're fading away. And ultimately, they come to an end. They cease. Painful sensations, those too are impermanent. Those too are conditioned. Those too are dependently arisen, subject to destruction, vanishing, fading away, and ultimately ceasing. And even that neutral state of neither pleasant nor painful, even that is impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen, subject to destruction, vanishing, fading away, ultimately ceasing. Seeing it this way, Dīghanakha, a well-taught, noble disciple becomes disenchanted with pleasant feelings. They become disenchanted with painful feelings. They become disenchanted with neither painful nor pleasant feelings. Being disenchanted, they become dispassionate. Through dispassion, the mind is liberated. When it's liberated, there comes the knowledge. It's liberated. And the noble disciple understands. Birth has been destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There's no more reincarnation. There's no more coming to any state of being. A bhikkhu, a practitioner, whose mind is liberated this way, agivasana. A bhikkhu like that sides with no one, disputes with no one. They employ speech that is currently used in the world without adhering to it. So we're going to pause there. That's kind of the juicy part of the end of the sutta. So I'm hoping that a few of the little threads I laid out in the beginning regarding like independence, sovereignty, liberty, regarding mind versus body and attachment to body. So I laid all those little threads or those little breadcrumbs or whatever metaphor, and then I'm hoping that they all sort of got solidified in the end there. And in particular, it's very Buddhist language, and in particular, it's very early Buddhist language. It's the language about becoming disenchanted and then ultimately becoming apathos, becoming dispassionate. And then through dispassion, the mind is liberated. Dispassion, the word that's being used here, the way that I was talking about that was this idea of needing things in order to be happy. So that idea of being in need of, again, whatever it is, entertainment, drugs, sex, whatever it might be, but the idea that I need that in order to be pleased versus dispassion towards those. And for me, I just want to emphasize that this is like the difference again between the desperately needing it and not desperately needing it. There's a subtle, like I'm trying to say something very subtle, which is that yes, in the early form of Buddhism represented by this sutra, it would be like extreme dispassion. extreme actually giving away all of your belongings. What I'm talking about here, call it like householder Buddhism or whatever. But what I'm talking about here is the difference between like enjoying something and being addicted to it. So the needing it versus the joy of life in that way. And of course, there are certain things that are probably detrimental to all of us, not to be enjoyed by anybody in that sense. But my point is that I'm not super, I'm not a monk, in other words. So I don't espouse those to be monks. All right. Any comments about dispassion, disenchantment? In particular, dispassion and disenchantment with pleasant feelings, painful feelings, neither pleasant nor painful feelings. Noe?
Thank you, Michael. What a
Yeah.
wonderful sutra and how appropriate. Thank you so much. It comes to mind is that idea, of course, the early text, I'm not a monk, but I do find equanimity and I find serenity as a daily thing, as sometimes an hourly thing is, find the serenity of this moment or this conversation or being able to set my view aside and going, what is that view? Why do I have that view? I love this sutra in that
Nice.
sense. And to be able to find, I guess, what he says here, that dispassionate, perhaps to find serenity and equanimity in this moment, in the here and now. Thank you.
Wonderful comment, Noe. Exactly what I'm kind of getting at in that way, that while the early form of Buddhism did again, encourage you to sort of renounce, be homeless, and all of that, I'm, tonight looking at this sutra, I'm really talking about, an experience that you could have right here, right now. And that experience would be about being good, like content. Like I don't need anything more. I don't really want to eat anything right now. I don't want to consume anything. I kind of don't want to watch anything. I don't need anything. I'm good. That freedom is available all the time. And what the Dharma is about, or what Buddhism is about how the only thing that's happening is we are cutting ourselves off from that. There's nobody doing it to us in that way. So that's where we kind of spend a lot of time reflecting upon our desires in that way, our anger in that way, our views in that way, all of that. All right. Any comments, questions? So there's one, I'm always interested, if you've been coming to Dharma Doors, you know this about me. I'm always interested in finding the little nuggets in these early suttas that sort of eventually become the foundation for the more developed Mahayana form of Buddhism. And one of those little nuggets, it's basically, if you know about the Mahayana Buddhist teaching of upaya or skillful means, there's a little hint in here about upaya. And it's that last line in paragraph 13 where he says, a bhikkhu whose mind is liberated doesn't side with anybody, doesn't dispute with anybody. And then the upaya part is that they use the speech currently used by the world, but without adhering to it. If you read, again, Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, if you read their footnotes, there's one use of language that the Buddha acknowledges and says, yeah, I use that language of the world, but don't get confused. And you know what that language is? The Buddha talks about how, oh yeah, I still use the words I, me, and mine, but I'm only doing that as a social convention. That is the particular thing that is being referenced here. Now, it could be about a lot of other things, but I just want you to know that that's the main idea, is that even it's the depths of the Buddhist philosophy here, where they even recognize, oh yeah, we still need to keep using this ridiculous language, but we're going to keep using it, but we're just not going to adhere to it as if language is pointing and referring to real entities. All right. So I wanted to highlight that last one. By the way, I totally forgot to mention at the beginning that I think it is he's Shariputra's, one sec. I think he's if you know Shariputra from the Heart Sutra, but from many of the sutras we've read, Dīghanakha, the wanderer guy, he's Shariputra's nephew. All right, so they're family. 2 weeks. This is, by the way, this is the traditional story. 2 weeks before this teaching, Shariputra had become a monk, and upon becoming a monastic, he became a Shrota-Uppanna, a stream enterer. And so, at the time of this sutra, 2 weeks after Shariputra had converted, but his nephew had not yet gotten on board, this happens 2 weeks before, all of that, or 2 weeks prior to this. And that's why it's interesting that in paragraph 14, it says, now on that very occasion when this exchange happened between the Buddha and Dīghanakha, on that occasion, the Venerable Shariputra was standing beside the Buddha, fanning him. And then Shariputra thought, the Blessed One, the Buddha, indeed speaks to us of the abandoning of these things through direct knowledge. The Sublime One indeed speaks to us of the relinquishing of these things through direct knowledge. As the Venerable Shariputra considered this way, through not clinging, his mind was liberated from the taints. He became an arhat. He became an arhat just from overhearing this conversation. But in the wanderer, the nephew, Dīghanakha, the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dharma arose. And what does that mean? That the immaculate vision of the Dharma arose? What that means is that he had this realization. Oh, wow! All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. He had a realization of impermanence. The wanderer Dīghanakha saw the Dharma, attained the Dharma, understood the Dharma, fathomed the Dharma. He crossed beyond doubt, did away with perplexity. He gained intrepidity and became independent of others in the teacher's dispensation. Then Dīghanakha said to the Blessed One, said to the Buddha, "Magnificent Master Gotama! Magnificent Master Gotama! Master Gotama has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been turned upside down, revealing what had been hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see. I go to the Master Gotama for refuge, and I go to the Dharma, and I go to the Sangha of bhikkhus. From today, let Master Gotama remember me as a lay follower who's gone forth to him for refuge, for life. And that concludes the Dīghanakha Sutta. Any thoughts about that conclusion? Either the Shariputra's realization or Dīghanakha's realization? These are both, of course, very important to understand. The Shariputra's realization about the abandoning of things, the relinquishing of things, but through direct knowledge. I want to comment on that really quickly. So, speaking very generally, paraphrasing, in terms of like relinquishing, like giving up, we kind of want to recognize that there's sort of like two things going on. So let's say, because it's kind of a Buddhist thing, let's talk about consuming alcohol. That's always sort of it's one of the precepts. It's one of the 5 precepts, of course. So let's say either because you were interested in practicing Buddhism, or you were interested in health, if you were interested in things, let's say you decided, I don't want to drink anymore. And so you put down the bottle, right? So you have now relinquished. You're not consuming it anymore. But, yeah, Noe, but you want to. You're not, but you'd like to. So that is relinquishment, but it's sort of only relinquishment in form, if you will, like, right? What Shariputra realized is abandonment or relinquishment through direct knowledge. And that is when you are done drinking. And what I mean by that is there isn't the desire. You actually now like are not inclined, but you're not inclined because you see, because you know it's foolish, you know it's poison, you know it's not helpful, you know all of that. And in the world of Buddhism, Buddhism, of course, is deeply aware of conditioning. It is deeply aware that if you condition the body, in particular, if you condition the body to sugars, your body will crave and need and want the sugars in many different forms. But Buddhism is talking about how there can be a radical rewiring of the mind that basically usurps that bodily conditioning. This is the practice. It doesn't happen overnight in that way. But I do want you to understand that that's what happened to Shariputra, is that he, even though he was already a monk and had kind of like relinquished sexuality, he'd relinquished belongings, he'd relinquished a home, there was a way in which he, in a way, was just doing those things. But upon the direct knowledge, at that point, we are to understand he had fully relinquished all of that. And in a way, didn't like, let me rewind. Remember the part where it was talking about that the noble practitioner views the body as like a disease? Like, you don't really want to have anything to do with the body. There's a way in which I could relinquish the body, but not really. But then that idea that, oh yeah, this is just a mess, that could be understood fully, directly. And then there would be the abandonment of attachment to the body, but by virtue of this kind of rewiring of the mind. So, Noe?
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. In that insight, recently I found just because I want a drink doesn't mean I have to have a drink. There's the relinquishment. It's not that my mind, my body, this tumor really wants to drink sometimes. And just because I have that, it doesn't mean that I have to follow through with it. And there's the difference. There's the insight. Thank you.
And Noe, it is just as important to recognize that you do want it. That is very important to recognize, like to not fool ourselves. So, Maria, comment?
Yeah, so this is pretty much exactly what happened with me. Like I quit drinking for a long time, and then I just kept messing around, like having a couple drinks or whatever, and it makes me really sick. But I was like, I'm lonely, or I just kind of want to have some beers with a friend or whatever. And then I did another round with alcohol, like at the beginning of December, and I lost again. And and so I really feel like this is it. This is the last time, because I had this realization about how it makes me a bad mommy. And, there was also some other things that happened um, with practice that was just like, stop taking practice for granted, and some other stuff. But it was just like, so done, so done. But also there was this realization, like I was thinking about, I'm getting pretty deep in here now, and even for the Buddha, it didn't get easier as, even under the Bodhi tree, as he got closer, to awakening, Mara's armies showed up. And I was like, I need to have some compassion for myself and some clarity around the fact that I see you, Mara. Like, damn it, there you are again. And so that was the moment where I was like, okay, yes, good, done. So thank you.
Don't thank me. Excellent. Excellent. And of course, what we're talking about here, or kind of what I feel like I'm talking about, and I think that's so beautiful, is that this is not about, or it's saying like, yeah, if things are detrimental to you, you should abandon them. But it's really about understanding, about really seeing, like seeing the effects it's having, understand the effects on others, all of these things. And, it doesn't have to be about the precepts in that way. It can be about any of these, whether it's like getting angry and just noticing like, oh, there it is again. And by the way, Maria, the comment on having that compassion for oneself, looking at, whatever happened in December as a learning experience. And there's no right or wrong. There's just learning, right? So I think we're all kind of hear, or at least hearing this the way that I would encourage us to think about it. So, all right, everybody, we did it again. We did another sutta. I'll be back next Sunday. We're going to talk about probably sutta number 75. Sounds pretty good. Another wanderer. Gnome.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there's an opportunity next weekend at the Dharma Collective. It's in person only, and I know for some of you that makes it unreachable, but we're doing a series of meetings called Listening with Curiosity, and this one is on the topic of the election. So it's an opportunity to practice what the middle section of the sutra was talking about, like put the, the rubber
Yeah.
on the road and actually try to talk about stuff that we can get pretty strident about. Speaking for myself, maybe none of you do. I don't know. So that's at 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. till noon on Saturday. And it's with Tenzin Joki, who's an amazing teacher, and two other co-facilitators, Mary Doan and Greg Morris. So if you're in the city or within reach of the city, I hope you make it. And then, oh, I put a link in the chat. And then just as usual, and for those of you who are new, who may not know, this is all of this amazing stuff that happens here. And thank you, Michael. I was so excited to talk about the class that I didn't think you is done, through Michael's generosity, and then we in turn have a chance to practice generosity by donating to support him. And this also supports the collective, which in addition to having a Zoom account, has a physical building and lots and lots of in-class opportunity or in-person opportunities. So I guess that's it. Thanks all for being here. And unless you have anything else, Michael.
Not tonight. Just happy to be back. Happy to be back with everybody. See everybody again. Missed you all.
Same.
Thank you, Michael.
My great pleasure.
Thanks.
All right, all. Have a wonderful
Noam.
night.
Nice
Hope
to
to
Thanks,
see you next
everybody.
weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Great to see
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks, Michael. Bye, Julie.